Watch this recent confrontation between Russian and Ukrainian troops closely. The Ukrainian troops are carrying two flags, one for Ukraine, but another with the Soviet symbolics. Why?
They're appealing to a kind of common legacy, and they wanted to present them with a symbol that the Russians wouldn't be firing at.
The history between Russia and Ukraine is a long and interconnected one. A brief refresher course.
Водружаются государственные флаги Украинской ССР и Российской Федерации, символ великой и вечной дружбы.
Well, Ukraine, like every other non-Russian republic within the Soviet Union, was the creation of the Russian, or if you prefer, the Soviet leadership in the 1920s and 1930s. These boundaries are drawn, and the attempt was to bring together within certain administrative units individuals who could be identified in terms of language, culture, and so on.
The geographic borders of Ukraine have remained mostly the same since they were defined by Soviet leaders. Back then, Ukraine was largely an agrarian society, but the Soviets built factory after factory in the east to serve Moscow, changing the Ukrainian economy in the process. Today, eastern Ukraine remains the country's industrial heartland. The Soviets also changed the population. In the 1920s, Crimea was dominated by the ethnic Tatars, but Joseph Stalin had other ideas.
And it's in 1943-44 that the entire Crimean Tatar population is removed from Crimea and sent off to Central Asia, primarily Uzbekistan. In their place come primarily Soviet Army veterans and their families, usually Russian. At that particular point in time, Crimea is becoming primarily Russian.
And Crimea would have stayed Russian if not for, legend has it, a drunken dinner party in 1954 when Nikita Khrushchev decided to give Crimea as a gift to Ukraine.
Готовился к празднику Крым, новая область советской Украины.
By the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine had been transformed. The east was connected to Moscow via a network of gas pipelines built in the 1960s and 70s. And while some Tatars moved back to Crimea, the area was now predominantly Russian. Crimea has kept a separate identity with its autonomous status even after Ukraine became a sovereign country.
Мы считаем и будем считать, что Украина наш не только ближайший сосед, а действительно наша братская республика.
Today, with the weight of all this history, Ukraine has few clear options. The new pro-Western government in Kiev is invested in preventing any breakaway from East Ukraine. Those regions with a significant population of ethnic Russians remain the country's industrial base. While the idea of Russian annexation is now bandied about, it's unclear in which direction Crimea will move in a referendum now scheduled for March 16th. Russian annexation is an option. Also,
what would be acceptable to Kiev, what would certainly be acceptable to the West, and what could be acceptable to Putin, depending on what he wants, is for Crimea to have some kind of super autonomous status.
But so far, both sides of this confrontation have been unable to find common ground.
Crimea was, is, and will be an integral part of Ukraine.
The Ukrainian government understands extremely well that Russia will always be a neighbor. Ukraine has to live with Russia. The problem is that Putin isn't so sure that he wants to live with Ukraine.